where he is involved in developing and delivering XBRL-related activities at KPMG. Joe currently leads teams of professionals advising clients on their implementation of XBRL and the testing of XBRL instance documents. Joe also focuses on the application of technology to business processes and the evaluation and testing of processes in connection with Sarbanes-Oxley. Joe is a CPA in both New York and Connecticut and has spent 22 years providing audit and advisory services to clients ranging from small startups to large multinational public companies. So I want to thank Joe very much for joining us today and sharing his thoughts. Just a couple of quick logistical points before we get started. As we go through the program, feel free to send in questions. You can click on the Q&A button on your console, and then you could submit a question there, and we'll be taking them at the end. We are offering CPE for this course, so if you've chosen to get CPE credit, please be sure to respond to the questions that we'll take periodically through the program. We're actually just going to take them in two sections, 2 questions in about the middle of the program, and then 2 questions again at the end. For those getting CPE, your certificate will be sent to you by the end of this week. So with that, I want to thank you again for joining, and I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you for joining today. We're very happy to have such a group of people on today. We're very concerned about the quality of data with regards to XBRL because that impacts the usefulness of XBRL and impacts the public perception of XBRL as a legitimate data source. So we're very happy that you're here and you're trying to learn more about XBRL, and we're trying to ensure that our filings are of the highest quality possible. With that, let's start with the first slide, Michelle. As we go through today's slides, there's a couple things that I'm going to stress. And the first is whether we have a general rule or we have some specific guidance that has been released by the SEC, by the XBRL U.S. Best Practices Committee, now also known as the Data Quality Committee, or by other industry trade groups or by the AICPA. So I'll be very clear in my terminology as to whether something is a general rule, whether something is specific guidance, or whether something is general interpretation that we've been following as we do our filings and as we test our filings. So with regards to dating of facts, there's a general rule that if something is a transaction or a balance and has occurred during a reporting period or at the end of the reporting period, it would basically match our context for that particular filing, which could be for the 3 months ended, for the 9 months ended, or for the 12 months ended, or it could be the period end. And in this case, on this little arrow that we have here, our period end is 12/31/2010. Generally speaking, if something occurs after the end of our period, so after the end of our 3-month quarter, but before the date of the filing of our 10Q, that would be deemed to be a subsequent event. Where we have tagged facts that relate to a subsequent event, we would use a subsequent event member in the date of that event. So say, for example, if we were looking at 12/31/2010, we were thinking that we were going to file our 10K in this case in February of 2011, and we had a subsequent event that happened on January 10th of 2011. That's within that filing period. So we would date the event or date the tagged fact with January 10th, 2011 and a subsequent event member. If something is going to happen and we are disclosing it after the filing of the 10K or the 10Q, that's deemed to be a future event. If we have something that is known and specific and will occur on 3/31/2011, we would use that particular date. Actually, sorry, we would use the forecast member and the date in the future. So in this case, 3/31/2011 and the forecast member on the scenario axis. And that would be the general guidance and the general rule. Over the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about some specific cases and give you examples of those specific cases. In a couple of the situations, I'm going to say this is a slide you may wish to remember and something you may wish to print or keep as a souvenir and hang up so that as you're going through and doing your tagging, you can refer to it, as it will be fairly common examples that most companies should have. And with that, we'll move on to the next slide. Looking back over the last couple of years, the SEC has had a series of FAQs as well as some interpretations. One of those FAQs was E19, and this was released fairly early and provides some guidance as to general tagging of what those facts might be. So for disclosures that relate to facts reported for a period within a Q or within a K, here's the general guidance as reported by E19. For something that is an instant type event and the date is actually disclosed, we would use the actual date of the event. So for something that is an instant type event and the date is not specifically disclosed, but some approximation is given, for example, maybe in May of 2014, we would use the end of that period, 5/31/2014, as a date for our instant type tag. So say, for example, you may have made a payment on a particular date, or you may have had a write-off on a particular date. If you specifically say that that happened on May 15th of 2014, then you would use that date of May 15th, 2014. But we know it doesn't always happen that way. As we're writing our Ks and our Qs, we sometimes, in order to make the language a little bit easier or to flow a little bit better, we might say in May of 2014. So we may know that it happened on the 15th, but the actual story in the 10Q or in that particular 10K would say in May, so we would use the end of period date, 5/31/14. Almost the same guidance is available for duration type events. If we have an element that is a duration type, so something like, say, for example, P&L type event, that the date is not specifically disclosed, but some approximation is given. So again, using that example, in May of 2014, something happened. Since the story in the 10Q or the 10K says in May of 2014, we would use a period start date of 5/1/14 and a period end date of 5/31/14. If we have something where we might say during the second quarter of fiscal year 14, in the first half of the year, something like that, we would also use appropriate period start and period end dates. So in our example of during the second quarter of fiscal 14, we would have a period start date of 4/1/14 through 6/30/14. One of the guidance that I give to many clients as we're talking through, how to pick the right date and how much do we need to do in our XBRL, I often try to tell them the story in the XBRL should match the story in the printed 10Q or the 10K. So you should try to get it as close to possible as the way you've actually described the data. There really shouldn't be a difference based on other facts that you might know, because then someone who is reading the XBRL might get a different answer than someone who's reading the printed document. So we try to make sure that the story that we tell in both documents is consistent. Moving on to the next slide. There are also a couple of rules in the EFM. And in the EFM, two of the rules that we want to talk about today talk about specific situations. So Rule 661, where we talk about reporting a particular fact. In this case, a non-numeric fact. So again, I'm going to try and make distinctions between what are the general rules and what are specifics, and then what are numerics and what are non-numerics. So non-numeric facts containing text about any portion of that or a prior year should have the current context for the reporting year. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, I thought we were only supposed to tag numeric values. And while that is the SEC rule, there are times that we may have a string of text or a factual statement or a sentence that is of value, and you may as a company decide that that provides value to a consumer of the data, and that that sentence or that text should also be tagged and disclosed in the XBRL filing. So for example, in fiscal year 2014 report, a company describes the litigation settled in 2011. Even though the settlement of the litigation happened in 2011, that textual statement is being made either in a Q during 2014 or a K during 2014. So the disclosure text should have a context of fiscal 2014 in that case. Slightly different rules between numeric values and non-numeric disclosures. So here again, we're talking about a specific non-numeric. Rule 662 is also close to that, so that non-numeric facts containing text about any portion of the year to date or prior year must have a context representing the current year to date. So let's talk about something where we might have had an event, in this case an acquisition, in our second fiscal quarter. So this acquisition happened in the second fiscal quarter. We would have tagged it in our second quarter Q using a for the 6 months ended, say June 30th, if it happened to be that calendar quarter. We would have disclosed any particular instant facts as having either the date of the acquisition or the end of the month that it happened, or 6/30. We think that the acquisition is still important, and we mention it in our third quarter 10Q. We have an acquisitions note that contains both values and text describing the same acquisition. Even though the acquisition happened in Q2, the text that we choose to tag will be rolled forward into the third quarter and should have a context of the first 9 months. So that would be a 9-month year-to-date context on that textual fact. And again, just to say, let's make a distinction between numerics and non-numerics. In this particular slide and with these particular 2 EFM rules, it's very important to see that the rule says non-numeric facts. Had we been talking about, say, for example, the purchase price, or perhaps some other numeric value associated with that acquisition in the second quarter, for example, payments made for the acquisition, perhaps there was a write-off related to that one particular acquisition, those would be numerics and they would still contain the second quarter fiscal period date. But any non-numeric facts would be rolled forward and would have a third quarter fiscal date. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. Another particular case that has caused a little bit of confusion is what do we do when we have a stream of payments or a stream of receipts and some future time period, be it a future quarter or future year or some future period that is, more softly defined. Well, if you remember the arrow that we had in the first slide, the arrow talked about anything within the period having a date that matched the period, and anything that was beyond our filing date, after the filing of our Q or a K, that those particular dates would have something called a forecast member on it. Well, one of the things that we have here is if we have payments or receipts in future periods, how would we deal with those? So I can think of this in a couple of particular footnotes. In the debt footnote, we might see future debt payments. In the leases footnote, we might see something like capital leases, future minimum payments due. Sometimes you see that in property, plant, and equipment or in debt also. If we also have some type of contractual obligation where we're making payments in future periods, we might also have a table, and that table might have something like, say, for example, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. Those future payment streams that we would need to tag. In the taxonomy, there are tags that are specifically set up for some of those types of streams. For example, the one I mentioned, capital leases, future minimum payments. There's a section in the taxonomy that breaks those out, and there are separate tags for each of the future years. So rather than trying to use one tag and put a 2015, 16, 17, or 18 date context on it, we would rather use the particular element in the taxonomy, or you might need to create an extension following the format that is in the taxonomy, which would be future minimum payments due next 12 months, future minimum payments due in 2 years, future minimum payments due in 3 years, future minimum payments due in 4 years, and future minimum papers due thereafter. The taxonomy has been set up with this type of a model to make it very clear that as of the end date of our particular quarter that we're reporting, using the context for the current quarter, we would then give the consumers of the data an idea as to in which year would we be making those payments, 1, 2, or 3. And we could use the same elements going forward as opposed to having to continually change dates. And if we were to use these elements, again, we would use the context for either the last day of the current Q or the last day of the current year. Supposing we had contingent receipts. Perhaps we had, an acquisition or a contract or something, and we were due to receive these receipts in future periods. We would then need to create an extension that was something appropriate for those receipts. And again, we would use that particular element following the same model. And in some cases, it's a fiscal year model or a fiscal year maturity. And in some cases, it's a rolling year maturity. Both of those models are present in the 2015 and 14 taxonomies and will be continued as long as they're necessary. But we would follow that same approach if we were needing to create extensions for these particular items. Moving on to another best practice guidance here, 2.1.2, subsequent events and durational concepts. When reporting a subsequent event for a durational concept, the period should reflect the known period of the event. So if the period is at the end of the reporting period or after the end of the reporting period, but before the data is filed, you would use a subsequent event member. Again, thinking back to that arrow. If the period is after the date the report is filed, you would use the forecast member. If in that particular instance there's some question, come back to these particular rules, 2.1.1 and 2.1.2. Moving on to the next slide, we come back to talk about forecasted information. And one of the things that I hate to say about XBRL is that there are many general rules, there are very specific rules, and there are also many exceptions to the rules. So here I'm going to give you a couple of guidance or a couple of exceptions to some of these rules that you should generally use when thinking about how would I tag my data. So when we're thinking about forecasted information, something that's going to impact some future reporting period, generally you would use the current reporting period date and a forecast member on the line items with the context date beyond the filing date. So again, thinking back to the arrow that we had on slide 1, something for 2010, but it's not going to happen until March of 11, well beyond the filing of my 10K. I would use a scenario axis and a forecast member with a 12/31 reporting date. We just talked about the estimated payments or the estimated receipts. You would not use a forecast member on them. String items or text blocks, again, are kind of one of the exceptions. So if I was talking about numeric values that will be impacting our reporting period in the future, then I would use the forecast member. If I was looking at something that was a string item or a text block, say for example, I might have a particular footnote that talks about a pending transaction that we expect to clear later, perhaps in the second quarter. So maybe an acquisition where you're providing some upfront information, but you expect it to clear in the second quarter of next year. You might tag some string items, say for example, a description of the transaction. Perhaps you're talking about some of the impacts that there may be. Those types of string items that happen in the future would not have a forecast member, but would be tagged with the current period context, a lot like the numerics. So again, just making the distinction, numeric versus non-numeric, current period versus forecast. Again, another exception that we had has to do with reporting dividends declared and dividends paid, as well as reporting dividends for the future. Now we've talked about using the current date when we have a particular instant tag or a transaction. We've talked about some of the other ways that we might do it if it was during the month. Well, talking about dividends declared and dividends paid is another unique situation And because of that, we have some very specific guidance as to how those should be presented. A lot of companies in their dividends footnote, or perhaps an earnings per share footnote, may talk about dividends being 5 cents per share in the first quarter and second quarter, 7 cents in the third quarter, and maybe 8 cents in the fourth quarter if they were having a good year. It might talk about the dates that the dividends were declared, the dates that the dividends were paid. These types of situations or these types of disclosures are a little bit more complicated. In order to drive some consistency, the XBRL Best Practice Committee a couple years ago wrote some very definitive guidance as to how these dividend-related tags should be presented in a set of financial statements, which dates should be used, and how they should be clearly defined using members. So again, this is an exception. When you're looking to report dividends declared or paid, the amounts or the dates, there's some very specific guidance where you would use members in order to very clearly specify which related to Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4, or which related to the annual periods that those dividends were paid in. This is very important because this is something that we see a lot of analysts having a desire for, a need for. It would be great to have them able to rely on the XBRL tagged information with regards to dividends. But in order to do that, we have to kind of steer all the companies into using a consistent approach or a consistent methodology for tagging their dividends-related information. So I urge you to go to the XBRL Best Practice Guidance on the XBRL US website and look at some of the best practice guidance for dividends declared and paid. Compare that to what you have in your footnote, and that should tell you whether you're being consistent with the guidance and with what other companies are doing, so as to have the maximum comparability between your company and others and reduce the likelihood of errors for any analyst consuming that data. But that's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular slide deck, and there's a lot of graphics there that have to do with members, so rather than fill up the slides, I'm going to ask you to go and look at that guidance and compare it to what you have in your current filings. With that, moving on to the next slide. I mentioned a little bit in terms of rolling forward an item, say the acquisition that happened in Q2 into the Q3 reporting period. And we see that a lot where things roll from cycle to cycle. And I know a lot of the software tools these days have got a lot of technology built in to help you roll forward items and to roll forward your balances as you produce each Q or roll forward each K for each annual period. However, it's still important to understand how these should be rolled forward so that you might understand when the software didn't get it 100% right, or maybe you had a new item that was inserted in this particular quarter that wasn't there last quarter, and that one didn't get rolled forward properly. So let's talk about a couple of things here with these roll forward items. And again, I'm going to make the distinction between a non-numeric fact carried forward and a numeric fact carried forward. Moving on to the next slide, we have an example. So here, much to the acquisition example, but a little bit more detail. In our September 30th, 2013 10Q, which was for the 9 months ended September 30th, a company disclosed in its subsequent event footnote the following statement. On October 18th, 2013, we purchased ABC Company for $100 million in cash. Now, since we've all been doing this for a while, we know that the right tag for that might be payments to acquire businesses gross. We would use that particular tag for the $100 million numeric value that's in that sentence. And we know from the sentence that it says on October 18th, 2013. So I'm going to need a context that closely tells the story that this happened on October 18th of 2013. So in this particular case, that element that we're going to use, payments to acquire businesses gross, is a duration type element. So I'm going to need a duration period. In this case, we chose to use a period of 10/1/2013 through 10/18/2013 to inform the dealer that during this duration, during these 18 days, we made a series of payments, one or more, to acquire the business for $100 million. Now, if you remember, at the top of this, it says, in the 9 months ended September 30th. So the other thing that strikes me is that this is a subsequent event. So with this particular tag fact of $100 million, we would use a subsequent event axis and a subsequent event domain and an appropriate member from the taxonomy to tag this and to communicate to the consumer of the data that the transaction is a subsequent event and what type it is. Moving on to the next slide. That was a numeric fact. Now let's talk about a non-numeric fact carrying forward. If we were to do this and say, for example, we had not disclosed that it was $100 million, but we had some type of sentence or phrase or paragraph or an entire subsequent event footnote, and that particular footnote needed to be rolled forward. As we disclose that particular subsequent event, we would tag it with the subsequent event footnote and a date of September 30th, or for the 9 months ended September 30th, because it would relate to that 9-month 10Q. However, when we go to report that item in the year-end 10K, we would change that date to be for the 12 months ended December 31st, or as of 12/31/2013, depending on which particular element we were using, whether it be a sentence or the entire footnote. So that's how we would tag a non-numeric fact carried forward. Moving on to the next slide. Let's give you another kind of example here. And this is one that caused some people a little bit of confusion when it was first released. So when we first started XBRL, and we had certain disclosures, like in this case, they happen to be the useful lives of some fixed assets. What we would do is we would tag them with a value of 14 and a value of 16 to show that the weighted average useful life as of June 30th, 2011 and 2010 was 14 and 16 years respectively. And that was the guidance that we followed in the beginning when we began tagging XBRL. And we might have a unit on there called years. After a couple years of doing this, we realized that there were problems in consuming the data. So we issued some guidance, not we, but guidance was issued to basically outline how we would handle something like this. And in order to improve the comparability of the data, these items were changed from decimal item types to duration item types to reflect the fact that they related to a period of time, and we wanted to make sure that these were better defined so they were consumable. One of the things about XBRL is that it is extremely important that we be very precise in how we define the data. As analysts and others start to write rules for consuming the data, they have to clearly understand how that data is being represented so that they can manipulate it properly. So these particular elements were changed from decimal item types to duration item types. Now, you might say, well, a duration item type, 2 years or 14 years or 16 years, isn't really a numeric anymore, so that would change the way we put dates on these. However, it doesn't, because even though it's a duration item type, it is still treated as if it was a numeric. So EFM Rules 661 and 662 apply to non-numeric facts containing text. This happens to be a non-numeric fact containing a numeric, so we would treat it as if it was still a value, and we would tag it with the appropriate dates. Again, just want to be clear about that because that's kind of an odd thing, because they're not really decimals, they're not numbers, but they are durations, and durations are treated as if they were numerics. Moving to the next slide. We have some CPE questions, and I'm going to turn it back to Michelle for a couple minutes.
Joe, thanks very much. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start with our CPE questions now. There we go. Okay, bear with me just for a second here. Okay, so we have our poll in progress right now, and if you can just click on the button that you see there. Okay, I'm going to close out that poll now. Well, what about, I'll give it just a few more minutes here. Okay, we're going to go back, now go to our next poll. So again, if you could just click on the appropriate response to record your answer. Okay, great. Thank you very much for responding to those poll questions. Okay, we're now going to go back to our presentation. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Joe.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, so we left off with an item here, and we were talking about durational item types. And I gave you an easy one there, and that was the estimated useful life of a particular asset. Let's talk a little bit more about durational item types. And again, these came about as we were a couple years into XBRL because we found that consuming the data was not as easy as we thought it was going to be, and we needed to give a little bit more guidance or clarity around the subject. So in our typical set of financial statements, one of the things that I might see here are things called, other types of durational elements, share-based payment award, and we typically have something called an award vesting period, which could be 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years. We might have something in property, plant, and equipment, the useful life. We might also have things where we talk about a particular term, maybe for example, patents, maybe the life of a litigation, maybe a few other things with regards to the share-based payment area. And I'm just checking for a second. What slide do we have up on right now? Okay, well, the slide I see on my screen is not the one that I think we're supposed to be on. Something may have happened with my communication. 1 second, please. Okay, there we go. So it was just me. So if I look at the slide here with the duration item type, we see a value here, and that value is in a particular format. And the format that we've adopted to use for durational type items is P, NY, NM, ND, NH, NMS, NS. And that gives computers and software programs a little bit more guidance in how they can interpret the values. So anything that, say, for example, is a useful life, or say a share-based payment award vesting period, say, for example, an option having a 10-year life, the value denotes the units as well. So it starts with the letter P, telling the software that it's going to be a period. And then if it was something that, say, for example, was 10 years, our value would be P10Y. If our value was, say, for example, 30 months, it might be P30M. If it was, say, for example, we have a 30-day warranty period, we might choose to tag that as P30D. This then helps the software properly interpret whether we're talking about years, months, days, the fact that it is, in fact, a duration type item, and to help us consume the data more easily and more correctly. Now, what if you're disclosing something in a particular footnote and it says the weighted average life of your stock option is 5.3 years? Well, how do you convert 5.3 into this particular format? There's a website, and you can see it at the bottom there. It's a free duration calculator. And if you go to that website, you can type in 5.3 years, and it will tell you exactly what that value should be in the format above. Sometimes we might have disclosures that have to do with hours, minutes, and seconds, and it would also help us with that as well. Now, there's a number of different ways you might be able to do this, but again, as long as you follow this format, computer tools and software should be able to interpret that data correctly. So the next question is, now that we know I have to do it this way, what guidance should I be looking at? And if we can go to the next slide, we're going to talk about another EFM rule that has to do with some of these string item types and dates. So in the Edgar filing manual, there's a rule here, 6636, that talks about how we might tag dates. Now, I know your first question is going to be, wait a minute, I thought we didn't have to tag dates. And the answer is yes, dates are not required to be tagged. However, in some cases, you as a company may decide that it provides value to a consumer of your financial statement data to tag that particular date because it's an important piece of information. So it might be, say, for example, the date of acquisition, for which there is a tag in the taxonomy. It might be the date that you refinanced your debt agreement. It could be the date that some litigation was settled, or some other particular fact that you have deemed is important enough to tag. Again, optional because it's not required, but it makes sense to tag it because it provides valuable information to the consumer of your financials. Well, when you have a specific and known date, and it says right there in bold white, if the date is known and specific, then there's a particular format for it. And you can see here that it says CCYYMMDD. So for example, if it happened to be April 15th of 2014, it would be 2014-04-14. Otherwise, you might not have the entire date. And again, because of the way we write our financial statements, it might say after 2007, or the transaction is expected to close before March 31st, 2009. Those types of dates do occur if you decide that you need to tag them, but you don't have the ability to fit them into this particular format because you have the words after 2007 or before March 31st, so it's not an exact date, it's an approximation. You would tag those as string values. Let's give an example here. In your financial statements, it says Tuesday, October 19th, 2010. Because it's written this way, you have all of the necessary components. It's known and specific, so you would tag it as 2010-10-19, and not as a string of Tuesday, October 19th, 2010. So again, this is very important because those individuals who are consuming your data, you want to be able to give them as much information as possible in the right format so they can come to the right decisions when evaluating your company. So making sure we get the dates right will help them make sure that as they're analyzing the information, they're putting it into the right chronological buckets. Moving on to the next slide, there's another rule here, 6637, that talks about the specific length of time. And this is the rule that tells us to use that format of P, N, Y, N, M, and D. There's an exception to that. If you have a known and specific date, like 5 years for the life of your option, then it's very easy to tag it as P5Y. If you have a sentence that might be written, the option is exercisable from 6 months to 5 years, but you don't know, or a better example of that would be have lives ranging from 6 months to 5 years. You don't know when exactly that life ends. Maybe you have a series or several tranches of options, and some of them are good for a year, some of them are good for 2 years, and some of them are good for 5 years. Because this isn't known and specific, you could tag the string or the phrase from 6 months to 5 years. However, if someone wrote in your financials 1 year and 8 months in those particular words, that is known and specific and would be tagged as P1Y8M. Again, it's all about making the story in your XBRL match the story in your printed financials. And again, there's a tool available for conversion. You can go to this Convert to ISO 8601 website, type in the particular words or information that's in your particular financial statement footnote, and it'll convert it to the right format for you. Moving to the next slide, we want to just handle the topic of decimals real quickly before we wrap up this session today. And you might say, well, decimals, we're 5 years into XBRL. I would have thought we would have gotten those all nailed down by now. And to the most part, we've seen a lot of improvement in the tagging of decimals and the tagging of information, whether it's rounded to millions or whether it's entered as a whole value, has gotten a lot better. But we still occasionally see some errors sneak through. Usually, just a few here and there. However, it still is a problem that warrants, a little bit of time and some discussion. So the decimal setting influences how numeric facts are interpreted. And before we talk about INF, let's talk a little bit about that decimal setting. That decimal setting is not meant to be a scale. It's not meant to be how we present the information in our human readable rendering. The decimal setting is meant to convey to computer software at what position is that information rounded or truncated. So let's say, for example, something was tagged as a -3. That says that it's rounded to 1,000. So the true value could be anywhere from 500 to 1,499, because that decimal setting will give you the position to which it's rounded. I mentioned INF. INF is another decimal setting that you can use, which means it is exactly the number reported. Anything other than INF is rounded or truncated. And you might say, well, shouldn't they all be the same? Like, why do we have that distinction? Why is that so important? Well, some numbers are exact numbers, and some numbers are rounded. For example, you may tag a fact that it may be $1 million. Well, is that really 1 million exactly to the dollar, or is that rounded to 1 million, in which case it could be a little bit less or a little bit more? If it's exactly 1 million, or if it's exactly 5 cents per share, then it would be the decimal setting of INF. If it was something that was rounded to 1 million or rounded to 5 cents per share, then it might be something other than that. In the case of 5 cents per share, it would be a +2. Let's move on to the next slide, and we're going to give you a little chart, much like the arrow on the first slide. And in this chart, you can kind of see where are the rounding positions and what decimal setting should you be using for each. This might be another one of those that you might want to keep as a cheat sheet or might want to keep in your training manual so that, as you have new people coming in to take over some of the XBRL work, they can, very clearly see what the setting should be. Now, why is it still partly, being discussed here, and why is it still somewhat of an issue? A lot of times this happens due simply because of miscommunication between companies and their vendors who may be assisting with the tagging of the financial statements or with the configuration of the settings, including the decimal setting. So there may be some miscommunication as to whether something is specific or rounding. The person with the best and most accurate information as to what that particular number or disclosure represents is always going to be somebody within the company who's responsible for the financial statements or for that particular disclosure. So whoever's doing that particular footnote or doing the tagging of that footnote needs to understand, is that $1 million an exact number and I should use INF, or is it a rounded number and I should probably round it to millions and use a -6? Again, the decimal will provide information to a software program how to interpret that data. Is it a whole number or a rounded number? And you might say, well, gee, really, shouldn't the software just figure that out? And if we go to the next slide, checking for incorrect decimals is programmable, and it is in many cases. But in a lot of cases, we're still finding that there's some errors sneaking through. The statistic that I give you in bullet 2 is from back in May, and it was 15,984 facts have the possibly incorrect decimals. Well, it's a little bit higher since then, but I simply want to show that there still are some problems with getting the decimals right. Incorrect decimals, well, what's the impact of them? If I have to input the number as the whole value, 1 million, I don't understand why the decimal setting would make a difference. Well, software may want to know, is this a whole number, is this rounded number, to what position is it rounded, because as it tries to do calculations, it could come to different answers. So incorrect decimals may hinder the interpretation of the data. If you're trying to use calculations or do calculations using tagged facts, so maybe, for example, an analyst was trying to calculate a return on investment or return on assets, and he was trying to do that using the tag data. Or maybe comparisons to peer companies where somebody may be rounding to the 100,000s and somebody else may be rounding to millions. Trying to do the comparisons may be a little funky if you're not quite sure what the decimals might be. So let's give you an example as to what one of the impacts may be on the next slide. And I didn't really think that the decimal setting was the most valuable piece of XBRL metadata until I started thinking about it, and I did this little example here to show how by changing the reported value or changing the decimal setting on the reported value, you can actually change the calculation of somebody's ratios and statistics. So if you look at the little table that we have here for ABC Company, we talk about revenues and cost of goods sold. Well, this particular set of financial statements doesn't have a gross profit. So what if I wanted to create a gross profit percentage? I could do a calculation using the XBRL tagged facts. So if I was using the cost of goods sold and the revenue here, and I wanted to create a formula, and I then wanted to calculate what my cost of goods sold percentage or my gross profit percentage might be, I would need to know A, what the value is, and B, what the decimal setting is, so I would know how it was rounded when I was doing my calculation. Well, you can see that 3 of the numbers here have a decimal of 0, so let's assume, and I know this because I did the example, that has a decimal setting of -6. But the cost of goods sold for March of 2002 is $218.5 million. And it's got a 0.5, so that one looks like it's rounded to hundreds of thousands. And that one actually does have a decimal setting of -5. If I was to just drop these into Excel and do some quick calculations, it probably wouldn't be far off. But if I was to do XBRL tagged facts and use some tool using the XBRL tag values, because the actual value of the 218.5 is more defined or more precise, rounded to the hundreds of thousands, I could get a wider swing in the percentage for gross profit or the percentage of cost of goods sold. So because of that, I could kind of play with the numbers a little bit. And I'm sure people aren't doing that, at least not consciously. But unconsciously, if they get the decimal setting incorrect, they could impact somebody's calculations and could impact their decision as to whether or not to invest in this particular stock. So an unintended consequence, where you may say, well, the decimal setting isn't all that important because I typed in the whole value, it actually could screw up somebody's calculation. So that's why we're bringing it up again. Please be cognizant. Those of you who are in the financial reporting group and are working on XBRL for your companies, getting the decimal settings right will go a long way, along with the dates, in improving the accuracy in the consistency of the data in your XBRL to your printed documents. With that, let's go on to the last slide. We're going to talk about proper handling of decimals and why do these errors occur, so that you can then be cognizant of these as you're doing your tagging. You might want to actually think about, gee, can I create a control that will help me make sure that we're getting our handling of decimals right? And what can I, teach the people that work with me as they're doing the review steps to look for when we're doing, our reviews of the Q's and K's? First off, lack of understanding of what the decimal setting really is used for and how it can impact calculations and interpretation of the data. Lack of communication with third-party vendors. Vendors may assume that it's a rounded number when in fact it's an exact number. Reviewing of rendering. I think we've kind of gotten past the stage where a lot of people are still focused on rendering. Really, it isn't that important. The SEC has said that rendering is not the most important piece of XBRL, nor should it guide a lot of your decisions. But sometimes when we're focused on rendering, we may think that by playing with the decimal setting a little bit, we can get the rendering to look closer to our printed document, and that's not necessarily a true statement, nor is it necessarily required, because a rendering is just there to help you. The true XBRL, the detailed data that goes into the SEC's database is what we're most concerned about. And the data represented more than once in the document at different scales or precisions. We didn't really talk about that, but say, for example, you might have your share count reported on the face of the income statement, and maybe it's rounded to the nearest 100,000 of shares or rounded to the nearest 1,000 of shares. And maybe someplace, say, for example, deeper in an EPS footnote, you might have the exact number of shares. Well, in that case, you have two disclosures of the same fact, the fact being the number of shares outstanding. So you would only tag that once, and you would tag it at the lower, more precise level of all the value, and just do that once. So those are a couple of the reasons why we're very concerned about decimals and why we, even 5 years in, we're still talking about decimals. It's something that it's important, and we want to help you through this process by explaining the why just as much as the what. So moving on to the next slide, I've got another one of these little cheat sheets, slightly different format. This is a tabular format, but this is something that you may also want to just pull out of the slide deck and keep with your tagging materials or with your training materials to help you with an idea as to, okay, when something is rounded or truncated to thousands, that should be -3. When it's a basis point disclosure, and sometimes we're talking about debt or interest rates, we talk about basis points. Well, those should have a decimal of 4. And sometimes checking these are some very quick hits that can be a significant improvement to the quality of your document. With that, that's all that I have for today. I hope you found this of interest. Again, these are some of the items that we kind of want to highlight because they still tend to creep in now and then. But hopefully we've given you some good guidance, given you the general guidance, given you the specifics and some of the rules. I'm now going to turn it back to Michelle. She's got a couple more CPE questions for you.
Joe, thanks very much. We have a couple of CPE questions, and then we have questions from the audience. So let's just quickly go through the CPE first. So I'm going to open up the next CPE question, and again, just click on the appropriate response here. If you're getting CPE, please make sure that your response is recorded so that we can apply the credit. Okay, I'm going to close the polls now because I think most people who are going to get CPE credit have responded. Okay, and now we have our last CPE question, which is posted up there right now. And again, for those of you getting CPE, your certificate will be sent to you hopefully by the end of this week. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. Great. Okay, and thanks very much. I want to go to questions now. And we have a couple of questions for you, Joe. The first question is, in your example, that is, quote, from 6 months to 5 years, would it be more appropriate to use the duration type element and then use the minimum and maximum members versus tagging with a string element?
That is actually one way to tag that particular item. If you kind of were talking about what would be the most accurate way to tag it, that's probably the right answer. And the reason being for that is when you use that particular approach, using the minimum and maximum members on that, you are tagging those as numerics, and numerics are always far easier to consume than a non-numeric. So somebody might be able to use that in a formula or calculation, and that would be the, if you want to call it, most useful way of tagging it. And that's also something that I would encourage people to think about. It shouldn't drive your decision. Your data should drive your decision, but always keep in the back of your mind, how would somebody consume this, and can I tag it so that it is most easily consumed by some analyst with the lowest chance of error? Next question.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, the next question we have is pertains to numerical facts that have multiple periods. For example, on December 1st, 2011, a company obtains a $10 million line of credit. For fiscal year 2014, how would that be tagged? Would the $10 million have a context of December 11th, 2011, or would it have the fiscal year 2014 context?
Since that would be a particular event that occurred at a particular date and point, you could tag that with 2011 because that would be the occurrence of that particular transaction. Now, you could also say that that particular line of credit, I think it was a line of credit, is still in effect today. So it is my line of credit that is on my balance sheet today, and I can tag it with the context of today's date. Sorry to give you a little bit of a gray answer. Probably the best thing to do would be to tag it with a current context if it is still the line of credit that is in place today.
Great, thanks very much, Joe. Joe, those are all the questions that we have time for today. I want to thank everybody for participating in the webinar today, and we will have more events coming up going forward. Certificates will go out the end of this week, and Joe, thank you very much for all of your words of advice, and we'll see you all in the next webinar. Thank you.